Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates, a podcast where we explore what's possible in the world of investing. If you've just joined us for the first time, a massive welcome to the community. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm very good, Bryce. Very excited for this episode. A little bit nervous because in the studio with us is someone who has had politicians and CEOs shaking in their boots for over a decade. Hopefully he goes easy on us today. Joe Aston, welcome to Equity Mates.
Thanks for having me. And the power is in your hands, not mine. So I'm the one who should be shaking in my boots.
So for people who aren't familiar, Joe Aston was the Rear Window columnist at the AFR from 2012 to 2023. And he's just written the book, The Chairman's Lounge, the inside story of how Qantas sold us out. And we're going to talk about Qantas, but we're also going to talk about your time at the AFR more generally. And we actually wanted to start with a quote that you didn't write, but was said about you. So this bloke, Joe Aston in the AFR, he should be hung, or he should be stripped and flogged, the bastard. Now, do you know who said that about you?
The great Gerald Harvey.
Yes,
Nice.
Jerry Harvey of Harvey Norman. And we wanted to start with that quote because I think it's instructive. I think Jerry Harvey is instructive. He's like a symbol for us of the really cozy relationship between media and business. He's a massive advertiser on a lot of big media stations, and a lot of big media stations are then very easy on Harvey Norman, perhaps don't report some stories about Harvey Norman. Your background was a political staffer, then you worked at corporate communications. You had all the ingredients to embrace this cozy relationship between the media and business, but you went the other way, and you went the other way hard. So why do you think you eschewed that relationship and the cozy relationships?
Good question. I mean, we all want to add value, I suppose, in what we do. I don't know that I was adding much value in the. Certainly, I think when I first started in journalism, I probably was just going the easy route, which was, reproducing the talking points of business people and contributing, I suppose, to the ridiculous myth of the business celebrity. So at some point, I can't say that it was like a flash of light moment or anything, but at some point, and I think it happened gradually, I realized that the way I could add value as a journalist was to show people what was really going on. And that included all of the cozy relationships and all of the self-delusion of Australia's powerful people. There are enough lemmings in the system who are contributing to puffing up the share prices, puffing up the mythology of business leaders. I wasn't really adding any value by being one more of them. And I guess I just had I have a flair for disrespect, I suppose. And Jerry was very upset at the time because I was pointing out the very exotic accounting of Harvey Norman and the way in which its franchisees that went bust would just magically disappear into its financial accounts, never to be seen again. You know, all of their debts would be forgiven, yet Harvey Norman claimed not to be responsible for them. So no franchisee that went under ever repaid its debts to Harvey Norman, and yet Harvey Norman, from an accounting sense, took no responsibility for those franchisees, and that system was designed especially for Harvey Norman not to pay payroll tax. That's the whole idea of the franchise system. It was very ingenious. It was an ingenious structure that was created, and it allows them to not pay a lot of tax. And then Jerry doesn't like being criticised. Who does? His reactions can be a little bit irrational, highly emotional. And yes, they were one of the biggest advertisers at Fairfax, where I worked when I first started criticising him, and then also at Nine, when Nine took over Fairfax. Having said that, Jerry may have gone on national television and called on for me to be hung, and of course he should have said I should have been hanged if he got the word right. But
Nice.
Many people would have agreed with him. But he never pulled advertising. You know, Jerry and Katie never pulled their advertising, or threatened, as far as I'm aware, to pull their advertising. So, you know, he made lots of noise, and he's entitled to, and he's a character. I'm not against. I don't want Australia to become a boring country and there to be no larrikins, but that doesn't mean that just because you're a larrikin, you don't have to be held to account or held to the standards of other people.
Well, Jerry wasn't the only one that you were going after. Your time at the AFR, you built a reputation for absolutely skewering some of the richest and most successful Australians. What are some of the columns or series of columns that really stand out to you?
I mean, I feel like a bit of a fraud, talking about my greatest hits in like, usually people do that for you, but, or they say do it when you're gone. But I had a lot of fun with, obviously Jerry Harvey was a definite favourite. I think Andrew Forrest was a definite favourite.
Yeah.
And I sort of, over a fairly long period of time and fairly early on, started to point out that he was saying some stuff that was right out there on the wacko fringes, completely inconsistent with his behaviour. His evangelising of this green dream was completely inconsistent with the fossil fuel tax rebates that he accepted every year, and the enormous wealth he had generated on the back of a highly emissions intensive industry. But the thing about Andrew, and I almost admire it, is he's just so shameless that he ends up appropriating criticism as almost a compliment. So when I was writing that I think I wrote something along the lines of there is cigarette paper, or it's a wafer thin line between a genius and a madman, and I think it's pretty clear what I'm trying to say there. And he started saying it about himself, and I was like, I'm not sure that it was meant as a compliment, but look, he is a visionary. I'm not taking that away from him, and what he has achieved is just unbelievable. Like, it is literally unbelievable that someone who went broke with a failed business was then still able to convince people to give him more money to start a mining company to break open the duopoly of BHP and Rio Tinto. Who the hell could do that? Well, he can. Yeah. And the thing is, then people forgive a lot of his mad tendencies, and a lot of what Fortescue's doing now, and a lot of the capital that they're allocating to some, fairly questionable, unproven business strategies. That's only allowed because people say, well, you don't bet against him.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you're a good gambler, you'd never say someone succeeded once, twice, so therefore you can't bet against them a third time. That's not very good. That's not a very good understanding of probabilities.
Yeah. Well, we actually had Twiggy on the show. Actually, we released it today as we're recording. So
you're joking.
Yeah.
Well, you could have let me listen to it first.
And let's just say, if you were still writing Rear Window, I'm sure you'd have some things to say. But you also need the madman to push the world forward. Is the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I agree. That's true. Yeah.
But look, we want to turn to Qantas, because you've just written the book on Qantas, and before, we've got some specific questions, but I guess generally for people who haven't seen your other press appearances or haven't read the book yet, what's the general story that you want to tell around Qantas?
So people have been very focused in the sort of general press this week on Qantas's influence in Canberra and its influence over politicians, and the way they do that via offering or agreeing to upgrades and special benefits like the Chairman's Lounge, which is of course the title of the book. The story is about how Qantas is the most incredible wielder of soft power and influence in Australia of all in the last 30 or 40 years. But that's relevant because while politicians are getting freebies from Qantas, it's their job to keep Qantas in line, and the whole point is they failed to keep Qantas in line when, during COVID and then coming out of COVID, Qantas screwed its customers to the wall, screwed many of its employees to the wall, went for absolute super profits, very short-sightedly, and the whole country was up in arms about it, and the political class didn't seem to get it or think that it was, they just totally missed this, as unfortunately did the Qantas board. I mean, that's my best attempt at a summary, I suppose.
For us as everyday Australians who are unlikely to ever actually get an invite to the Chairman's Lounge, why should we actually care about this story?
Well, why should you care about the Chairman's Lounge, or why should you care about the whole story? Because that's two very different things. I mean,
why should we care about the Qantas story?
Yeah. Because as a taxpayer and just as an Australian citizen, you should care whether or not Australian policymakers, and that's elected officials and the public service, are doing the right thing by us, the traveller. Are they creating aviation policy settings that are fair and competitive so that we can get good service and fair prices for what is an essential piece of infrastructure for a massive landmass where we can't drive to Perth, we can't drive from Adelaide to Brisbane, practically. And so that's why we should care that's happening properly, and it's not happening properly. And why is it not happening properly? Because one company controls 65% of the market domestically. They control more than 50%. They're allowed to be in a partnership with Emirates where they collude on pricing and schedule and control more than 50% of the market to the UK, nearly 40% of the market to the EU. You would not allow ANZ and Westpac to merge its branches. You wouldn't allow Coles and Aldi to merge its logistics centres. So why would Qantas and Emirates be allowed to do that? And so why are we in a circumstance where one player with 65% of the market is allowed to have unbelievably high prices, absolutely appalling customer service standards, and nobody does anything about it, all while hundreds of Commonwealth officials, elected and unelected, swan around the chairman's lounge, fly Qantas 90% of the time, even though there is a rule that they are openly flouting, that they should take the cheapest fare of the day. And of course, Qantas is the cheapest fare of the day 0% of the time. So it's quite clear that rule is just made a joke of. So that's why we should care about the chairman's lounge part of the story. And the broader part of the story is why should we care that for the same reasons that aviation is critical to the proper functioning of the Australian economy. Why should we care that one company can merchandise our loyalty, shamelessly create this brand that is all tugging on the heartstrings of our patriotism, and then use that to cash in and screw us over in a national crisis? I think we should all care about that a lot.
Now, you started writing about Qantas and Alan Joyce before the book. You started writing probably late 2022. You really focused on what they were doing.
Yep.
And Qantas responded at the time by removing the copies of the AFR from their lounges. Mm-hmm. Interesting move for all their business travellers. But you then got the book deal and wrote the book on Qantas. Have they played any dirty tricks? Have they tried to shut you down in any way? We saw Alan Joyce hired multiple PR professionals. So has there been any response from the company over the book?
Yeah, well, I talked to Qantas executives many times in the writing of this book. They were quite cooperative, not on the record necessarily. Well, I put dozens and dozens of written questions to Qantas, and they were all answered. Very honestly, and there was back and forth where we disagreed, and I found that to be a really good faith process and a very, very different approach to Qantas when Alan Joyce was CEO, which I thought was a promising sign, and I give them full credit for that. They are finally engaging with their critics. And as I say, talked to lots of Qantas executives, still there, people have left recently, people have left a long time ago. So no dirty tricks. I also tried to talk to Alan Joyce. I contacted him on multiple occasions, and I was really actually quite eager to include his direct perspective in the book. He declined to do that. That's his call. What can you do, right? You try. I did the same with the former chairman, Richard Goyder, who also declined to participate. And so I did my best to include their perspectives as far as I could get them from others or imagine them, and to give them credit for what they got right. This is a story about a lot people who made a lot of mistakes. I'm not pretending otherwise.
During the book tour for the last few weeks, you've caught your biggest fish yet with the Prime Minister. How have you found that, the last couple of weeks, and what's been the response from the office?
I didn't sort of, you put it as catching a big fish. That's not the way I set out to do this. Nobody who actually reads this book would ever or could ever describe this as some sort of partisan hit job on Anthony Albanese. That's just not what this book is. There's a passage that people have very much fixated on, which I don't back away from, by the way. It's there, it's right, and it's legitimate to talk about it. But it's one small part of the story. And I think it's interesting to see the opposition go very quiet on this very suddenly, because they know that amongst their number, they've all been doing exactly the same thing, and it's only a matter of time till, like Jason Clare, the education minister, was caught out on the weekend. Well, to his credit, he just put his hand up and admitted to it because it's true, and it's what they've all been doing.
Mackenzie.
Bridget McKenzie hasn't disclosed yet the the solid number of upgrades that she has received and never disclosed. I mean, in Albanese's defence, he disclosed his.
Yeah.
Maybe not the manner in which they came about or the type of upgrade they were, the kind which are a confirmed upgrade which only Alan Joyce can issue, not the kind where you go to the airport with a neck pillow and your fingers crossed, the kind where you get the ticket changes from economy to business or to first well before the day of travel. You actually have a ticket that with the new class on it. So all that aside, look, it was pretty staggering to see the Prime Minister sort of stumbling around with his multiple versions of denials, non-denials, semi-denials, then attacks on me. It comes with the territory, right?
Yeah.
I'm writing things that people don't want to be published. I'm very accustomed to being shoot the messenger type attacks. The Prime Minister's press office is, madly briefing how much of a Satan figure I am. That's what they're paid to do. I've been a staffer. I've done it myself. It's all part of the rough and tumble.
Yeah.
I want to ask your perspective on some of the criticism because of your background as a political staffer. So, like, some of the criticism is obviously kind of outside, like fails the pub test, that classic quote, like asking for upgrades directly. But then I thought some of the criticism was maybe a little bit unfounded around like the CEO of Qantas and the Prime Minister or senior ministers having direct lines of communication. Like, maybe this is just my perception, but I would have thought that's pretty common that like major CEOs and major politicians are talking directly. From your experience as a political staffer, is that the case? Or is that unusual?
Yeah, sure. No, it's totally normal.
Yeah.
Of course they do. That's what ministers do with their stakeholders. They talk to them all the time. And you can be assured, I have first-hand experience of this, Qantas CEOs are very involved in the political process. I shouldn't say political process. They're very involved they're very engaged with their Canberra stakeholders. They go there to Canberra in person regularly. They meet with the relevant ministers personally all the time. So no, I mean it's not right that there's nothing abnormal about those kind of communications. But that's in relation to policy issues, not in relation to upgrades.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Just makes me wonder, like, if you drilled into any industry, like, I guess there's nothing as salient as asking for airline upgrades.
I don't know if this is what makes politicians unable to see the public's perspective on this, but airlines are quite unique. There's not really any other industry where really significant financial benefits can be provided to politicians and it not sort of be just seen as out and outright corruption. Like bank CEOs can't give money or interest-free mortgages to politicians because that would never be allowed. And you could do the same, you don't send baskets of the Coles CEO doesn't send baskets of groceries to politicians. So it's and also a basket of groceries might be worth $50 as opposed to an upgrade which is worth up to $10,000. It is a really unique. It's why it's such a great subject to write about. And it's why people really are drawn to Qantas stories like moths to a flame.
Yeah. Well, let's start unpacking some of the problems at Qantas. And pre-COVID, there was a lot of mythology around Qantas being Australia's carrier and Alan Joyce being the best CEO in Australia. Was that ever true?
Well, it was once true that Qantas was Australia's national carrier, especially before the privatisation when you had Ansett and Australian Airlines were domestic airlines and Qantas was the international airline, and then that all changed when Australian Airlines merged with Qantas and it became both a domestic and international carrier. But, that's a long time ago. Qantas is a national carrier in a marketing sense only. It's one of multiple Australian carriers. Was Alan Joyce ever the best CEO in Australia? Hard to say. There was a time in which you could argue reasonably that he was a very good CEO. I think you could also argue that he made mistakes and that he still had detractors and a lot of the criticism was still legitimate. And what I've tried to portray in the book as I sort of go through his record before COVID is there were things he did really well, and that included taking an airline that had much higher costs than all of its international competitors and all of its domestic competitors for that matter, and just incrementally chip away at the cost base and try and get its cost on level with everyone else's, because otherwise you got to have higher prices or you lose money, and they were losing lots of money. That is boring and unsexy work. No one goes, you are the best CEO ever for just cutting 4% of costs year after year after year after year, right? But it was a really fat, lazy organization. I worked there at the time when he took over. And by the way, in the defense of Jeff Dixon, his predecessor, it was still much more efficient than when he'd taken over. So that's what Jeff Dixon had done as well, just chip away. It's a form of government business. It was run like a department. Yeah. The people walking around it with their short-sleeved shirts with ties, that guy has been here since at least 1950. Yeah. There were dozens of those people. You then go into the period of time where he has these huge losses. He's trying to make the company more efficient, and they then start to shift into profit-making mode from 2015. They've had this record $4 billion loss in 2014, which is still to this day the record, even after the COVID years. And what clearly Joyce does at that time, they have a new financial framework, and they start disinvesting in the business. They go from spending, sort of $2.5 billion a year on aircraft, sometimes $3 billion, to $1 billion or $1.5 billion. And so, that's a lot of reduced investment and therefore a lot of increased profit. Now, again, this is nuanced. I'm not saying that is 100% the wrong decision to make, but there's sort of like a spectrum. Should they have cut it that much? Maybe they should have cut it half as much, maybe increase profits a little bit, but do you really want to let your fleet just get really old really quickly? And that's what they did. And in those years before COVID, when he was a hero, investors loved him because they were getting huge buybacks and dividends all of a sudden, and the stock price just went from $1 something to $7.50. And if you own shares that you get a 7-bagger, you're going to love the CEO. But through the cycle, that was a decision that was always going to come home to roost, because that capex has to be made. That those planes have to be replaced. That moment's coming, and now it's really coming now. So even when he was seen as this great success, he deserved some of that credit, but nobody had yet realised how they'd got to that point, and it was a large part of it was disinvestment.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the problems that you identify in the book can sort of trace back to the Qantas's board's lack of oversight or lack of leadership in some cases, and the Charlie Munger quote in Incentives Predicting Outcomes is instructive here. So can you talk about the board incentives at Qantas at the time and what they led to? And I guess the follow-up question is, do those incentives still exist today?
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, and there was an extract in the AFR about this particular issue. The board, there's sort of objectively what the board did, which is not much. They continue to back Alan Joyce blindly, even when the brand was in crisis. That's not just me pejoratively throwing that out there. That I'm talking about consumer research firms like Roy Morgan, RepTrak, all saying the Qantas brand is in crisis and its biggest problem is Alan Joyce. And even when that's happening, the Qantas board is blindly just backing Alan Joyce. They defer to Alan Joyce. They get talked around by Alan Joyce, and there's no evidence to suggest that any of them just banged the table and said, you've got to get you've got to change here, or you've got to go. There is an incentive structure that is unique to the Qantas board in Australia. And it's not well understood because the accounting has been quite tricky in the financial accounts. Qantas board directors get travel benefits that are very, very valuable. So a non-executive director of Qantas receives 3 long-haul tickets return anywhere on the international network in the highest class of travel for free every year, if I haven't already said every year, for themselves, their domestic partner, and every one of their children aged 26 or under.
Wow.
On top of that, they get 9 domestic legs return anywhere on the network in business class for free every year, if I haven't already said that, for themselves, their domestic partner, and all children aged 26 and under. So if I've done the maths on the basis that say, Sydney, London return airfare in first class 3 times.
For the whole family.
For the whole family.
Yeah.
Each year, plus the domestic. You're talking a value, if you went near the maximum value of that based on the retail price of the ticket, plus the fringe benefits tax that is payable by the company, because of course this is pre-tax money that they're, if they were going out and buying it, they would have to pay out of post-tax income. Now, that's $500,000 a year.
Yeah.
The thing is, Qantas accounts for it in their financial accounts, not at the cost of the ticket, not what they charge the customer for those tickets, which they should, because by giving them to a director or their kids or whomever, they take those seats off sale. They become unavailable for sale, either for cash for the ticket or for points, which also reduces the balance sheet liability of points for the company, which, by the way, if you think about the A380 services to LA and London, the first class cabin is full on every flight. Every flight. There is never an empty seat. And that's because even if they don't, and they rarely sell all the first class seats, a whole bunch of business class passengers apply to use 100,000 points to upgrade to first class. That's valuable, liability reduction for the company. So that's all happening, but Qantas is valuing the benefit of the boards in the remuneration report. They're valuing it at just the cost to the company. It's not really the cost of the company, because I've just identified what the real cost of the company is. So they're really minimizing it. They're just saying, it's the taxes and charges and the FBT and the FBT payable on a discount airfare. So it's a total fudge. Now, I put this to Qantas in the research process, and John Mullen, the new chairman, made sure that they have started it from the current annual report that just came out in September. They now at least disclose that that's what they're doing in terms of the way they account for it. That doesn't mean they're changing it, though. They're still very happy to do it. And John Mullen gave an answer at the Qantas AGM where he sort of said, this has very rarely got any real cost to the company. And I like John Mullen and I respect him, but I just think that's a really poor attitude, and it's not a plausible answer, because of course there's a real cost to the company. I mean, if there was no real cost to the company of giving the children of directors 3 first class flights to London every year for free, well, why can't every employee's child have it? Like, why not give it to, why don't the children of cabin crew all get it? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And it is just so, especially at the moment where Qantas's reputation is, it is just so hilariously out of step with community expectations. And by the way, institutional shareholder expectations, now that they are aware of this, the adult children of these directors can swan around the world for free, given where airfares are, given the way other staff have been treated. Where does that leave the Qantas board? It leaves them, if you properly account for what they're really receiving in benefits, as the highest paid directors in Australia, more than the directors of Commonwealth Bank, BHP, and of course Qantas is 1/20th the size of those companies. And so where does it leave a Qantas director when they have a dominant CEO who is having his way and his view of the world accepted, and the company's in strife and going down a reputational sinkhole? I'm not talking about the individuals in particular, but I'm talking, as you say, about the behavioural economics of it. If you're like living it up like that, if you have a job that good, are you the person who's going to say, we're going to change this, we're going to treat our customers better, or I am going to resign? Well, how many of them did that?
Especially because you disappoint your kids as well.
Come on.
Correct. I mean, I can't let down little Johnny. He's going on... He's going away to he's off to Ibiza, and all of his friends are sitting in the back row, and he's up there on the...
So, Joe, for everyday investors like us and a lot of the community listening at the moment, what are some red flags that we should be looking for in company reports to, I guess, illustrate misaligned incentives or these hidden executive benefits?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always look for obvious things like related party transactions, and you got to look very closely at board remuneration. However, I have to say, you could look at 5,000 annual reports and never find anything like the Qantas board directors' benefits. I mean, there's just nothing much else out there like it. I mean, adjusted earnings is always a good sign of bad culture. If companies are constantly excluding abnormal items, which are actually regular costs of doing business, capitalizing all the software, that's become harder to do under accounting rules, but it's usually a good sign. Aggressive accounting is a good sign that of a poor culture. Qantas was, excluding really normal operational costs for years, even like transformation costs. Even before COVID, every year, $200 million of transformation costs were excluded from underlying profit. At what point, if you do say 5 years in a row of 100 and something or 200 and something $1 million of transformation costs, is that still transformation, or is that just
BAU.
Is that just BAU cost cutting every year? I mean,
yeah.
there's lots of examples of that.
So one final question on Qantas, Joe. If you look at it today, you know, we're an investing podcast here and we love analysing businesses. So how do you analyse Qantas as we close out 2024 with new leadership in place? And if you want to give us a buy, hold or sell rating, we'd love it as well.
Well, I mean, not financial advice.
Yes.
Bryce's hat is my disclaimer today. At $8, Qantas is a sell. And that's not even really picking on Qantas. Airlines are trading stocks. The hilarious thing about Joyce's last few months was that he and Vanessa Hudson and their former lieutenant Andrew David, they have this investor day, and they're telling investors about how, you know, they're basically, I mean, I'm verbalizing them slightly here, but they're basically suggesting we've broken the cycle. Demand will exceed supply as far as the eye can see. You know, we've totally smoothed out the cycle of aviation. No, never mind. And this is like 2 years after COVID hit. It's like you'd have to have rocks in your head not to be laughing out loud at this presentation. I've had reason to rewatch it several times now. In the end, the Qantas stock price will go up and down, and the only way he will make any long-term money out of it is by trading it. At this stage, I mean, at $1 you can buy it and hold it for sure. And Pendle, formerly BT, to their credit, have done that very well. When everyone hates it, you buy it, and when everyone loves it, you sell it. It's pretty basic. What the market's failing to sort of take into account, as they were, by the way, failing to take into account in 2023, when the stock price was getting towards $7, is just the enormity of the capex job ahead of management for the reasons that I've explained. Qantas now has an average fleet age of about 16 years. Alan Joyce inherited a fleet that was aged 8.
Oh, wow.
And when obviously, as you know, with averages, that means that they have a lot of aircraft that are a lot older than 16, and that certain fleets of sub-fleets are very old, and others are young. Like the Dreamliners, they're all young. The A330s, which fly around Asia and between the East Coast and Perth, you know, really now getting into their 20s, a lot of them, and they're awful to fly on, and they need replacing, and you've got all the Project Sunrise capex, the domestic fleet, the totality of the domestic fleet, 737-800s. There's 75 aircraft that Qantas bought from American Airlines when it went into Chapter 11 after 9/11. So those aircraft, you know, the narrow body planes that we all take between Sydney and Melbourne or Brisbane or whatever, they're old. You know, they're all getting well into their 20s as well. Now, there's 75 of them. Qantas has ordered 28 replacements.
Wow.
Now, I don't know how 75 is supposed to go into 28. But, you know, so my point is, you think the capex is big. It's bigger than they're even saying. It's much bigger than they're saying. In 2017, 18, 19, before COVID, Qantas was taking 3, 4, 5 new aircraft a year. Next year, it's 20-something. The year after that is 20-something. Year after that is 20-something. That 20-something aircraft a year, that's kind of eat up so much of their cash flow. Yeah. Now, the only way you do that is to keep prices and to keep their prices as high as they are now. How do you do that if the competition is not keeping their prices at that? No, so they have a lot of pricing power domestically, no doubt about that. That's an awesome business. It's on like an 18% EBIT margin. But internationally, they've got the oldest planes in the sky, no Wi-Fi. They've cut the guts out of the they've reinvested significantly in the catering, to be fair. But you know, you're flying around Asia to Japan or Singapore, Hong Kong, wherever, and you're competing with really great airlines. Singapore, Cathay, JAL, ANA. Up to Europe, you're competing with the Gulf carriers, which are terrific airlines, and of course have beneficial economics. But that's, no point complaining about that. That's who Qantas is competing with, and the idea that they can allow their product to continue to decline and keep their prices as high as they are is a dream world. I think their international business is really exposed to deteriorating economics, and that's all going to feed into profitability. And that's my very long answer.
Nice. Good. That was good. So, Joe, just a couple of questions around Australian business culture to close out. If there's one thing that you want this book to impress on investors regarding corporate governance, business ethics, and the like, what is that?
Okay, well, I think ultimately the umbrella answer to that is corporate governance. And I think there's two parts to that. One is the leadership of companies, of management of companies. 15 years is too long to be the CEO of a large Australian company. I think that is now obvious. There were opportunities for Alan Joyce to retire at 11 years. Even that's a long time. But if he'd retired in 2019, he would now be remembered as an Australian business legend. You know, he'd be the chairman of BHP or Commonwealth Bank, and you know he'd be feted all over town. And I'm sure he wishes he'd done that too. And of course, the reason I say that, I point out that year is when the Qantas board, instead of saying, okay, it's time to go, they gave him a contract extension at 11 years. And by the way, one of the things he subsequently tried to do is say, I stayed, I was going to leave, but then COVID happened. And what was I meant to do? I had to stay and get us through this crisis. Well, in actual fact, they all talked about it in 2019, a year before COVID happened. And he said, yeah, okay, I'll stay. Give me another 3 years. The board should never have even contemplated that. You know, at that period of time, that was a failure of Joyce to nurture talent beneath him to the point where they were ready to take over, and of the board's succession management. And then that gets me to my second part of the answer, which is the board's failure. And I think the professional company director class of Australia need to have a long, hard look at their own performance and their own motivations of doing the job. There are just too many directors who are desperate. There's lines around the block to get onto Australian public company boards. But why? So that they can, you know, get chauffeured around, get their Order of Australia pin, sit in the chairman's lounge, nod and smile, and be, you know, important. You know, be part of the elite class, you know, the ruling class of Australia. And those are the wrong motivations to be on a public company board. There are not enough directors who are doing the job properly. I mean, because there's too many examples for me to be saying something false here. There are too many examples of boards who sleepwalk into this stuff all the time because they're all sitting around, you know, having this cordial. The Qantas report into its own governance said that the board was too collegiate in its approach and too deferential to Joyce. Now, in some ways, saying that the board was too collegiate, that's just a euphemism for the board was a social club. You know, we all loved each other. We loved going on these trips together. You know, we'd bring our wives and our husbands, and you know, it was just all such a happy time. That is not the job. And too many people seem to get the idea that being on a board is a hobby or, you know, a lark. I think this is a cautionary tale about that.
Listening to you give that answer, it reminds me what we're missing now that you're not writing for the AFR, someone to call it like it is. And I think, you know, as we wrap up this interview, I'm reflecting on like everyone has their moment where they found you in the AFR. I think for me it was Blue Sky. That was the first one where
Crikey.
Yeah. But you know, there was CPA, there was Rio more recently, Qantas obviously.
Yeah.
Like
Magellan's one of my favourite ones.
Magellan. Yeah. Like I think you've done a lot in calling out some of the bullshit in the Australian finance industry, but you're not writing Rear Window anymore, but I'm sure you're paying attention to sort of what's going on. So if you were still writing Rear Window today, who would be your top target? Like, who are you looking at and you're like, I wish I could write something about them today?
Oh, Chris Ellison.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, well, Chris Ellison, but also his directors. I mean, the idea that he could stay for 12 to 18 months is so laughable. You know, what he has admitted to have done, let alone what he's alleged to have done and not admitted to, it just makes your eyebrows turn white. And so that statement that the board put out on Monday was just such a joke. I would be having an absolute field day with that. But I also have to say I felt pangs of sadness when the WiseTech stuff happened. I obviously wrote a few things about Richard White when I was still at the AFR. It was pretty early to pick him as an unusual character. And founder syndrome is obviously something that I focused on a lot, you know, because founders are, you know, a ball of contradictions. They usually really zany characters to have the vision or, as I say, the madness to think that I can do this enormous thing and then do it. People follow them for all of their strengths, but also, you know, they know what's written on the tin. I'm not sure everything that Richard White was up to was written on the tin, but I felt like it was almost there in invisible ink.
Yeah. interesting. Well, I'd love to see you write about
I
Nelson.
know. Yeah. Well,
I only met Richard White once. I've corresponded with him a couple of times, but I only met Richard White once. It was at the annual Sydney Institute dinner in Sydney, which is a big political do. And his PR people, he found out from his PR people that I was in the room. He comes bounding across the room. And I've never met this bloke. And the second he's like, hi, I really wanted to meet you. I'd really like you to come and stay at my place for the weekend in the Hawkesbury River. Okay. It's like the second sentence of his introduction to me. And I'm like, whoa, this guy really comes on strong. Clearly he's a bit unusual, but, unusually talented as well. This is the thing. Like, no one can take that away from him. No.
Well, Joe, we'll leave it there. For everyone listening, Joe's book, The Chairman's Lounge, The Inside Story of How Qantas Sold Us Out, is available. We'll put a link in the show notes. But it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you, Joe. Cheers.
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful.